Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Frank and Stan chat. And this is edition number 258. And for those of you watching on our video cast, you'll notice that at the bottom of our screen there is a colleague of ours, John Malynn, who is back for his third visit to the Frank and Stan chat. So it's good morning, John.
Good morning, Frank. Good morning, Stan. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, we've always enjoyed these. I think John's experience, which he'll explain in a minute, sort of adds a certain sort of something to these discussions because I think his background is rather unique. And bearing in mind we had a lot of political upheaval this week already, and we're only on Wednesday. But also there was yesterday the Education Select Committee met the Chief Inspector. So John and I know quite a lot about those meetings. So anyway, John, do you want to give a little introduction, sort of 1 minute summary of who you are, how we know each other, and what you're doing?
Okay, thanks, Frank. Yeah, I'm a retired civil servant. I spent sort of the latter part of my career in education, firstly within DfE in sort of senior policy role on school accountability, where I was the departmental lead on Ofsted, both in terms of school inspection and the wider relationship between government and the inspectorate. And then spent my last few years actually within Ofsted.
Now that we should give you credit here because I'm not sure there are many people that have done that. Been the main person within the DfE around school accountability, who's then invited
Yes,
invited to join Ofsted under Michael Wilshaw's reign, wasn't it?
that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So this is a very special colleague that we have on that we're very fortunate to know. So, and then what happened after that, John?
Well, spent time as one of Sir Michael's lead inspection policy advisors. Stayed then in the early part of his successor's tenure and retired in 2018. But I've been the school governor for 20 odd years by then. And I've continued as a school governor, currently chair in a primary school in Hertfordshire, which is now part of an academy trust, and do some bits for the trust as well on sort of policy and other matters. They draw on my expertise, and I'm happy to chip in there. Um, and I also sit as a member of a standalone free school in Hertfordshire as well.
Wow. Well, John's background and current work actually seems really useful to have that insight this week, with so much going on with the Prime Minister, in a sense, standing down from his role as Prime Minister. Or is he? No, he's carrying on with the role of Prime Minister, but he's relinquished the role of the leader of the Labour Party. Is that the way I view it? Is that correct? I think that's the way it's worked out.
I think he's relinquished his role as Prime Minister, but given a date by which that
It
will
will it
happen.
will go. And so we then, because it's quite useful to sort of give a little summary because these stay on the internet for for quite some time. It's a sort of the backdrop of the discussion.
Yeah.
And then and then we've had an MP, a fairly big figure in the Manchester, where he's the mayor, actually sort of winning a by-election, and then suddenly being sort of considered to be the next leader of the Labour Party and therefore leader Prime Minister. So all of that's got to play out, but it's quite a big political week this week. And I think what we'll start with is we'll get to something not related to, well, it is related to politics, isn't it, Stan, in some way? It is.
It,
It
it
is.
is, but more to do with experience on holiday. I've just been in Spain for a week. Really nice time, really hot weather as it is here today. I think it's good. Put it in context, today's going to be the hottest day. It's going to break some records, I think, today. But one of the things that struck me while I was on holiday was seeing families having a really good family holiday. And most of those were probably, I don't know, I didn't ask any of them, uh, foreign nationals, i.e., Germans, because this is in Spain, Spanish, French, Irish, because we have a thing now with two pieces of data, I think. One, attendance is everything, and if you don't attend school, your life finishes. And secondly, that we've seemed to have forgotten that parents are key players in the education of children. In fact, they have more time with the children than we have with them in schools. And it struck me that maybe we don't value things like the family holiday. We can't do, because if we did, we wouldn't be threatening to fine people who took a family holiday in school time. So we've clearly devalued a family holiday against a week in school. And the reason often put forward for that is the lack of continuity in the curriculum. See, my belief is that lack of attendance is a curriculum issue, not an attendance issue.
Mm.
It's about managing a curriculum that can cope with somebody taking a week off. But that aside, if we look at what's possible, is it possible to put some project weeks into the school curriculum where it doesn't depend on previous learning and it's not an important factor in future learning? It's something that had in its own right, like an art week or a music week or I hate to say a European week that we used to do in the days we were joined to Europe, which could then, if those were attached to half-term holidays, probably the May bank holiday, either side of it, we could perhaps relax those rules on attendance and suggest that for that week, if parents wanted to take their children abroad when it's financially better, then we would waive the fine. The children would miss out on that extracurricular, let's say, that work, but it wouldn't be devastating for the rest of their lives.
John,
I-
John, what do you think of that?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I suppose, one interesting point on that is the holiday timetables for a lot of European nations and Ireland are very different. So they actually finish for summer much earlier than we do, which begs a whole question about the structure of the school year, doesn't it? Whether, it's time to take a fundamental look at that and see whether there's a better way of actually setting out the year, and maybe a more flexible one that gives schools flexibility, but taking account of one of the points about, you get the issue of children in neighbouring areas where you get problems where one school is holidaying at a different time to other. That's the downside.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that with siblings, one in secondary school, one in primary school, but those are manageable problems, and they're problems for individual families. They're not problems for the nation, and yet the example I said to you before was a museum visit while I was away, and seeing a family on doing a museum visit, all very interested in what was in it, and I thought, yeah, if a school were doing that, which funnily enough they were at another time when we were away, we'd be praising it. I would, and saying that's great experiential learning, that builds on their knowledge and understanding. And yet, if a parent takes a child to do that same visit in school time, we threaten them with fines.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem to make sense.
I always feel as though there isn't enough freedom for head teachers to make a sensible decision on this. So let's have a scenario here where you've got a child or a family whose attendance is sort of like 96-97%. And they come to you and say, "Oh well, we want to take a week in early May, for a family holiday." To me, I'm thinking, well, probably that can be accommodated. But if you've got a child whose attendance is sort of 81% and it's declining, you think, well, perhaps that's something that we shouldn't sanction.
Or it depends, Frank. I'm going to call you out on that now. It depends what the outcomes are on that child, not how many days they're in school.
Yeah, but the thing is that
if that child's the brightest child in your school, then does that make a difference to somebody who's not very bright?
No, it doesn't really. I mean, I think for me the issue is around, because that actually makes it too easy for a head teacher to sort of find a way around it. Just say, well, we're going to sanction that because this child's actually, very capable and whatever. I think this, and just going back to the point about the family, that if there is, I remember somebody coming to me and saying, I want to take the children to Florida for 2 weeks. And in those days, when I was ahead, there was, let's face it, 96% attendance in those days was fantastic. You know what I mean? And actually, this idea of persistent absence, that was toughened up. That's been toughened up considerably since we were heads. So this measure has become more and more challenging. And as it's got more and more challenging, it's become very difficult for me as a head with that family saying about going to Florida. Just, yeah, that's fine. I said, as long as we can have a scrapbook coming back and they can talk to the class about the what their experiences were in Florida, I'm up for that. But nowadays, you don't have that flexibility, do you? So I think for me,
that's key, I think, Frank, because when I was ahead, we had a teacher whose family lived in a different part of the authority, same authority, with a completely different holiday pattern. And her husband got 2 weeks off a year, what we used to be called wakes
weeks, yeah.
And that was the only chance of a family holiday. So I agreed that she could have 2 weeks unpaid leave so that they could have a family holiday. Now, obviously, not getting an income put the cost of their holiday up significantly,
Yeah.
but it was the only way they could get a family holiday. And I really didn't have to think very hard about it. It was the only way that family could have
could
that
actually do it.
experience. And if you think back to your own life and your own childhood, family holidays play a massive part in what you learn.
I remember more of those than I do of the maths lessons I had.
Yeah. So I think to sum up,
it says a lot about my maths, doesn't it?
I think I've done a little summary here. We protect the core curriculum by stopping saying that this is a sequential part of your learning this particular week. We recognise that not all learning has to be sequential. We treat parents as genuine partners in education. We acknowledge the financial reality of taking a family holiday and focus on educational outcomes rather than attendance in itself. So we stop this, as you say, pressure, panic on and you've seen how misrepresented the data on attendance is.
Yeah.
It's flawed in very, very many ways.
Yeah.
Yet you'll get somebody, a well-known speaker, who talks about, missing 2 days and losing 2 grades off your GCSEs or something.
Yeah.
And it's data misinterpreted to make a point. And I just think we need to just step back a bit and recognise families are really important to education and stop having a war with families and start working with them.
We'll move on to John now, but if I can no, it's just to say, I've said this story before, but I remember being in Blackpool working as the chair of the Education Improvement Board there, talking to a newsagent who said, it's a family business. My wife and I run the newsagents. We've got 3 children. So we can't afford to close during the summer holidays. We can't afford to close during the half-term holidays because that's where we make most of our money. So when am I supposed to go on holiday? When have I got an opportunity to take my children? He said, I just have to pay the fine. And this is not a wealthy man. This is a business in a so not on the seafront. I can tell you that now. But it's a challenging area, and I really sympathise with him. There's a sort of sense that everybody's circumstance is similar to the politicians who are actually making these decisions, and they're not, are they?
And equally, I mean, I am not suggesting, and this is probably the sting in the tail, that teachers can take weeks off work.
Yeah, but there is some. I mean, we could get on this. This could be the chat for the entire time. But I do remember appointing a teacher and saying, I said, "Are you really excited about starting?" She said, "It was the beginning of my career." And then I said to you before, Stan, she said, "One regret: I can never get to Glastonbury now." Now, a good head would be able to, a school would accommodate if that was a big thing. You would find a way around it, but in a way, there's no flexibility in some schools and some sectors. There's no flexibility whatsoever, is there, for you to manage your family and to, anyway. John, what's caught your eye this week?
Obviously, being from a policy background, policy announcements are something I keep an eye on.
I'm glad somebody does. They sound really boring when I read them.
But over the last month or so, looking at sort of recent DfE announcements and updates, the first one that struck a chord was the revised statutory guidance on suspensions and exclusions, which for some bizarre reason the DfE published on the first day of half term, which I thought was extraordinary, really. Was it urgent? No, because it doesn't come into effect until July. So why would you put it out in the middle of a holiday period? I mean, is that showing due consideration for school leaders and others? But there's been a number of recent announcements as well. Governors having a role in food standards. I mean, one of the latest wheezes seems to be
there's going to be a food standards governor.
Yes. Yeah, fascinating.
It is. I mean, in a way, you can understand where they're going with this, can't you? They're worried about the policy being pushed out, and then actually, it's nobody sort of monitoring it at all. So it's a waste of time, really. Because it's going to have a full impact.
Although Ofsted has been mentioned as well as a possible.
I know. Well, that's where I was going to go with it. I think
we've been around that territory before, haven't we?
I mean, I can actually say most inspectors going into schools will struggle to make an informed and agreeable judgment together on reading standards. All right. Imagine what the discussion is like around food standards amongst that group of inspectors. It was around just how these things are actually felt as though there's somebody out there who knows what they're talking about.
And there's one on every governing body.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
And there isn't.
Yeah. There's also allergy awareness. That's again,
that one.
All worthy stuff, but a new policy on allergy awareness. Enrichment advisors, ambassadors appointed this week. That might be interesting to look at, what enrichment activities happening in schools at this time of year, and whether a trip to Europe might be more enriching than.
But actually, if you're in a primary school and you're post SATs, there's a lot of enrichment going on. Yes. I've got our second eldest granddaughters in year 6. They haven't touched maths since the SATs, and so they're out doing lots of really, she's going into school buzzing. It's just fantastic, stuff going on.
There was a rumour you can't get a coach between the end of May and start of July.
Oh, I saw one at our school today. They obviously booked it last September.
But I heard of a case of a trip that's happening this week where children are going to probably spend anything up to 3 hours on a coach for a short distance that they could probably do by train.
Yes.
Which means that the place that they're visiting, they'll be lucky if they get 2 hours there.
Yeah, but the point being is that, do you get to a point though where so many of these policy announcements, even if they're well intentioned, there's just so many of them that one just swamps over another, and another one washes up against another, that in effect nothing happens.
No, but you're right, Frank. The only way to make it happen is to say, well, Ofsted are going to inspect it.
Even if they haven't got the capability.
Yeah, even if
doesn't matter about the capability.
Somebody having a school meal when they arrive and making a judgment on it.
Oh, God, I mean,
it's interesting. One of the other earlier announcements that's in the white paper was about having a governor's annual report to parents. They used to exist about 20 years ago. An annual report and an annual meeting, which nobody ever attended.
No.
So it's like we're reinventing wheels that never actually rolled.
I know.
Nobody attended unless there was a real issue in the school, and then it was all.
Yeah, but that's true of annual general meetings generally, isn't it? For large companies, if the CEO's earnings, I don't know, £15 million with a £10 million bonus, then loads of the shareholders turn up to harangue the board for that sort of decision making. So if there is something, I suppose in some respects, but the thing is that how do you manage that? This is not a you haven't got the defense of the board, have you, behind you? If you're the head teacher, I always felt as though you're just sort of putting yourself out there to be hung, drawn, and quartered. If you haven't got a board that's going to get behind you, it really, I think it's very tricky. I think those sorts of meetings.
Yes. But going back to sort of why this particularly struck a chord with me is it sort of begs the question, we back to sort of drip feeding, policy announcements out without proper consideration of workload implications and, the ability to implement these effectively to get the right impact. When you and I, Frank, were in government, both in Ofsted and me in DFE, workload was a big thing. You had regular meetings between the department and Ofsted and others, and with the professional associations to actually consider the workload implications of things that were being implemented. I don't get the sense that's happening to the same degree anymore.
No. And I think it's interesting. My son-in-law used to be part of a teacher group that met the Secretary of State or one of the ministers, there's about 20 of them, drawn from various settings across the country. And that felt to me like the place where you would, somebody like yourself, John, at the DFE or a colleague, would say, well, these are some of the initiatives that we're going to be pushing out over the next couple of months. Can you help us in terms of have a read through the drafts, give us your views, and when is the best time to actually share these? Now, he became part of that group, but I'm not aware that they did anything like that. It was really about the minister would turn up, say, this is what we're going to do, and they go, what do you think? And in a way it was about, well, we have shared it. They can then say, well, we have shared it with some teachers. No, not the trade unions. These are independent people giving their view, but it was never at the detailed level of the analysis, about how can we make this work better, Do you remember those meetings, John? Did you ever attend?
Indeed, yes. I was at a number of them.
The one for me, if I can just, because it sort of, I think it does lead into this. The thing that caught my eye this week was the Secretary of State, the HMCI, attending the Education Select Committee yesterday, where he was challenged about how effective the current framework is in ensuring that the well-being, not just of staff, of the head teacher, but all staff. And there was a lot of push to the Education Select Committee in advance of this meeting. And so I was part of a group that looked at sending a survey questionnaire to all the heads who had been inspected since the beginning of January. And there was, I think we potentially had about 1,300 schools that had been inspected, and we got about 100 back. So accepting it was a relatively small sample, but 2/3 of those who responded said that they felt that the new framework was not an improvement on the previous one, and that only half thought the ratings that were given by inspectors were fair. And you'd think, oh well, perhaps that's all the low attaining schools, but it wasn't. It was some of the higher attaining schools, that were previously done really well under the old framework, were not doing as well out of this one. But actually, it's quite interesting. Only a third found that the advice that they were getting from inspectors was valuable. So this felt to me quite a significant shift. These results, and so what happened was the committee pushed. It was Martyn Oliver and Lee Alston and the social care director quite hard on these results, and they are undertaking. Ofsted sort of defended it by saying, well, we've got an independent sort of highly regarded evaluation that's going to be publishing in 2027. And I'm thinking, well, you started the launch in 2025. It's quite a long time, and there was no clarity about when in 2027. So it could be, you could say, well, it could be January 2027. I suspect it isn't. but it's probably later in the year. So you're virtually getting to the first 2 years before you get an evaluation. And our independent evaluation suggested things are not going well. So if that is reflected also in what Ofsted's getting in their survey results, then that is deeply worrying. And I think the thing that came out was this idea of the Ofsted or chief inspector defending it on the basis of this is what we've done. But our survey and others were suggesting, yeah, but the outcomes from that aren't very good. And it highlighted for me the big issue around an inclusion grade in the current framework, which is getting really good, generally much better grades than all the others, primarily because all it's doing is describing the provision. It's not actually describing the outcomes. And so what we're ending up with is, and in a way you can see this being played out with the select committee, and to me it links in with the chief inspector's sort of fact that he's never inspected, is, you can have the greatest provision in the world, but actually if nobody wants to engage with it, or it doesn't seem to be having any positive impact, it can't be described as great. There's a lot of it, but it's not great. So for me, the issue here was around how he defended, that attack from the select committee by describing provision. And really, they should have pushed him much harder, I think, on the outcomes of the framework, because there are a number of senior leaders who are under a lot of stress and strain on this framework and being left, I think, hanging out to dry a little bit through it. So that for me is something I'm going to sort of pursue a little bit harder, I think, over the next few weeks to sort of try and make a case, explain that to others. And I'm starting here today.
It is quite worrying listening to the feedback you've had from those 100 schools, and thinking, back to our time where, you had the Ofsted mantra, do good as you go. You don't sense that there's any of that anymore. They're probably doing more damage than good at the minute, and that is really, really worrying. One thing that's going back to one of your previous guests who I happen to know, you interviewed John Hayes.
Yes, we did.
A while ago. John, who's a head in Camden. I knew John when he was a school improvement partner in Islington, who's exceptionally good, highly regarded, and I trust him. The fact that inspection has had the impact it's had on him is a worrying reflection on the whole system, I think, because if it can have that impact on, a very experienced executive head like him, with all the breadth of knowledge he's got also as an advisor, what's it doing across the system as a whole?
I think one thing that many people out there will not be aware of, if you're an inspector, long-standing inspector, you will know about this. But Ofsted undertook a significant cull of OIs. That is, some of whom were former HMIs who had taken retirement and actually were still doing some inspection work. But Ofsted said that unless you've left within the last 2 years, you're not eligible to be one of those sorts of inspectors. So that is to say, you're not allowed to lead an inspection. I think that's the way they did it. So they can continue to be a team inspector. So what's happened is a number of those inspectors who used to lead are now teaming. And so what we've got is a lot of relatively new inspectors filling that gap. And there is I think Stan and I would agree that not every head teacher is going to make a good inspector, and neither would every inspector make a good head teacher. This idea you've got to be a head to, I'm not entirely convinced by that. But actually what we're finding, I think, is that if you're in a situation where you're leading with only a little bit of experience, coming up against a challenging school is a significant challenge for you. And some of those issues are starting to lean into the framework, which actually, with regard to, it's got to be an absolute secure fit in terms of the grade descriptor, gives that lead inspector very little flex. So we're finding that that's where the problems are occurring, is that it may be 7 bullet points in an expected standard criteria for an area, but you've not hit one of them. And because it's a secure fit, you're the grade below. Now, I think that for that newbie, I think that's a real challenge, because all you can do is fall back on the descriptor tells me this, and that will not satisfy a school that's unhappy with that judgment. Just to say, well, it's that one bullet point, which might be the most, the least important of all the bullet points in the area. That's the bit that's really, really causing a lot of problems at the moment, right across the
Yes.
board.
And I think, Frank, I mean, we said right from the start, it takes away the inspector's integrity because an inspector might look at those and say, well, yeah, you're actually short there, but it's ridiculous to say you're a grade lower than that because you've hit 6 out of the 7 and the other one's only a minor miss.
Mm,
And actually, you've got some in the grade even above that. So to effectively downgrade you in some aspects 2 grades because you don't fit exactly, when everything I know about schools and all my experience tells me that's where you are, it's a nonsense.
yeah.
And I'm finding feedback where people have said, the lead inspector has said, well, we're probably at this grade, but they've had to ring Ofsted and then they've
Uh-huh.
been told you can't,
Yeah. Yeah.
you can't lead, even though the lead inspector is saying, well, that's a
Yeah.
wrong judgment.
I I think that what I think what we're finding is that heads who previously had under other frameworks had actually come out of these inspections well, in that they got some stunning grades or whatever. They're still getting some stunning grades, but they're having to fight so much harder to get that grade. And what's happening is that one phoned me up and said that the lead inspector had said, "Oh well, I'm going to give you this exceptional grade," and but I need to phone the duty desk, and I don't think the duty desk said, "Oh well, we've had so many of those grades this week, we can't let another one go through." But I can imagine that conversation going along. Oh, well, you're the fourth school that's phoned me about the exceptional grade this afternoon. I need to really think about how that sits against all the others. I can imagine a duty desk discussion going like that. But then the lead inspector going back and saying, well, actually, I phoned up the duty desk and actually they don't think it meets the standard. And I'm thinking, no, 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 no. It's the inspector's job on site to make the judgment, not somebody sitting in an office in London somewhere, listening to a bit of the evidence, has not visited the schools, not met the head, doesn't know, nothing about it. You think, well, actually, that's not really good enough. And it takes away that sense of corporate responsibility that I believe still should be with that inspection team. And if it requires a duty desk to oversee all of those judgments, actually, the chief inspector should never have let that inspection team undertake the work in the first place. If every time they're expected to make a judgment, they've got to, a judgment at the top grade, they've got to phone in. I think, well, actually, you don't really know enough about the top grade then, do you? If you have to phone in, you're worried about those judgments. So, yeah, I feel sort of, you get battle weary with it and you think, just give up
Uh,
on
the other thing, Frankie, I always sort of use this as a question rather than an argument, is what percentage of schools are in trouble? And is it about 3 to 5%?
Well, that's normally what it comes out at.
Yeah, that's been the same for
Yeah.
20, 30
Yeah,
years.
never changed really, has it much?
So so why not take the money
Yeah.
that this is all
Yeah.
costing and invest it in those 50, maybe 15% if you take those on the edge, 15% of schools to fix things, to
Yeah.
put them right.
Well, it's funny, the alternative big consultation that Professor Colin Richards and I did last year. Colin wrote a piece called Imagine, based on the John Lennon song.
Mm.
And that's precisely what he was saying. You know, um, make where you know that there are some weaknesses in a school, offer HMI support on a regular basis. If you get to a point where you feel as though actually it probably does need an inspection to unpick all of this, do the inspection and do it really well. And then from that inspection, then identify the resources that are required to improve that school. Because at the moment we're spending, it's 230 million, 240 million is Ofsted's annual budget, I think somewhere like that. And we're spending most of that on the school budget on schools that are coming out all right overall. We're not putting them into
I think
the bottom
if
category or anything.
yeah. this really was a missed opportunity, I think, for government and Ofsted. When they first floated the notion of report card, if you look back at report cards in the States and other places, the report card wasn't the inspectorates. It was a reflection of the school as a whole, and some of that data was collected through other sources and put together, and an inspection component was added. So the report card wasn't owned by the inspectorate. It had a much wider, and this was an opportunity to say, do we need universal inspection in the same way? If we look at when universal inspection started with Ofsted, you had no data published. There was very little intelligence about what was going on in schools. If you look at where we are now, there's tons of that out there. You don't need to be inspecting to find it. It's already there. So inspection should be more targeted. It should be looking at where are the gaps, where are the worries. Yeah. That's where we need to do most of our inspection activity.
I would agree. I'd say, where are the outliers? Where are the ones that are doing brilliantly in difficult circumstances? Let's investigate and find out what they do well, so we can share that. And where are those where, for almost generations, these schools have continued not to improve? So why aren't we investigating how? They've used the phrase "stuck schools" before now, haven't they? How is it a school gets into that position, and how do we fix it? I don't think we've learned anything about true school improvement. I don't think we've learned the sequence of improving schools that are stuck. I think we just continue to measure them and tell them that they're still stuck.
And I think that's why schools are complaining about, from our feedback, that the advice they're getting is not valuable.
Yeah.
And actually that boils down to, as we got last week, we had Jill Monday on. I don't remember Jill from the days in the local authority inspections. And she gave a summary of her experience, and we had Alwyn Pugh on a few weeks ago. And 4 minutes later, we got to the end of the range of his experience. But, when you're drawing on that sort of level of experience, even with no data, you've got a sense of, well, this is probably going to be close to what we think, it ought to be. But actually, if all you've got is relatively inexperienced inspectors relying on some dodgy data, ignoring some of the things that they're seeing in front of them because it's sort of counter to what the data is saying, I think you're in really sticky ground. And I think you're right, the missed opportunity here. You're going to do inspection, do it well, don't do it like it, because to me it's like going back to your point about the DfE announcements. The monitoring of food hygiene standards, that's not going to be done thoroughly, is it? On a 1.5 day inspection with a couple of inspectors in a primary school, that is not going to be done that well. Enrichment judgments, a list of after school activities, we don't know who turns up for them, but whatever, who's paying for it? It's just all pretty flaky evidence, just to make it look as though somebody's keeping an eye on it.
Just going back to select committee, one of the things that struck me about the chief inspector's evidence was around the behaviour and attendance, because they pushed him quite hard on that. And one of the first things he said was that the picture isn't as bad as has been painted. But when he was pressed about whether he's actually looked and drilled down into the behaviour component and the attendance component, he said he hadn't considered it, which I thought was astonishing. Why? That's probably one of the things that's been raised with Ofsted. From very early on with this framework, you would think, well, why don't we do some analysis to actually drill down and see what's actually going on?
I got a sense there was a lack of, he wasn't inquisitive. It was about, again, going back to the outcomes against the provision. This was about, well, we're going to deliver those inspections. That's it. I'm not that inquisitive about what we're learning from that. We haven't got the people now that there used to be who are experts, say, in attendance or behaviour, who will do that little bit of digging, perhaps go out to 10 schools and get a sense for recently inspected ones just to see how things were working, particularly in good schools and not so good schools, and write a short paper on it, or a paper that go to the board, might change the focus of, for the next 10 weeks, we want to drill down even deeper into the behaviour attendance issue. There's none of that going on anymore. We've lost that sense of, well, why is it like this? It's about delivery, numbers, get the inspections done. That's all it is.
But
I
is
sort
there enough data now? I mean, the latest data released for schools, the heads are saying to me, no, everything about us is on this sheet. Why isn't that the scorecard? Why isn't that the scorecard for every school translated into pretty colours if you want to for parents, etc. And then, as John said before, have a component on it that might relate to regular inspection or might say that this school does not require a lengthy inspection. It will be, visited by an HMI once every 3 years.
Well,
Just save the money, save the pressure on schools, and if you look at outcomes, it's not making that much difference, is it? All this pressure isn't, suddenly making schools different.
no, and actually, when you think, just pick up on John's point about the scorecard being a school's responsibility as opposed to it being an Ofsted responsibility. You know, imagine what in about 5 years' time, our third granddaughter is going to go to secondary school. She'll be looking at a scorecard with lots of colour, or her parents look at the scorecard, lots of colours on it, and actually that's 5 years ago. And then look at the data that sits within the scorecard and say, well, hang on a minute, attendance is 97%, but it said it was a concern on that scorecard. And most parents are going to look at the little colour of the dot and make that feel as though
Yeah.
that's the most important bit of data. The fact that it's 5 years out of date, and Ofsted don't care about. I get a feeling they just don't care about that. This is where it comes to me about it's about a delivery model. Well, we've done it. We've produced a scorecard. We said we'd produce a scorecard. The fact that it's over time not really worth anything, I think is really sort of, in a way, if you're putting parents first, then that is not putting parents first. That's tricking parents into believing something's better than it is. If it's 5 years since you last inspected it, and that's the last time you put that little coloured dot on your scorecard.
No, isn't that evidenced by the number of outstanding schools who were no longer outstanding after
Yeah.
between 5 and 10 years?
Mm,
I mean, schools change, but
yeah.
I think I'm thinking on top of my head now. But a report card that used the data that schools get, I can't remember the acronym for it at the moment.
ISDR.
Yeah,
idea.
if,
Oh,
if
yeah.
that is translated into average against similar schools, average against national, and sent as an annual report that the school has to use a self-evaluation to parents, has to evaluate its performance against that data, and that's an annual report to parents, then inspection needs to be a visit every so often just to just feel if the school is where it should be.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the outcomes are there. If those drop dramatically, then you can inspect to find out why.
Or
But
increase the number. I think this idea of inspection, I'm becoming old fashioned now, where I just think I used to hate the bit where the HMIs used to just rock up and have a chat with you. I remember Ian Roger, who was one of the most respected HMIs I'd ever met, because he was very perceptive in a half-day visit, chatting to me as a new head about giving me some advice about how I might want to progress the school. And I think that I'm going back to, yeah, I think we need some of those. I think that's where the focus needs to be. Some really, really high quality people making unannounced visits, or just a half a day notice visit, not a heavy sort of protocol about this is what you need to cover, I need to do this, not even a letter, just acknowledging that I visited the school. But if actually he needed to escalate it, because actually there were some concerns that were emerging over a couple of visits, then actually that could lead to an inspection. And I think that for me is a healthy way of working rather because we need to, you're trying, Frank, to get that area improved. It's not improving. And we come to that decision. So the focus here now, we're going to come in and do a proper inspection, not a light, sort of soft, flaky,
or a proper inquiry,
Yeah, inquiry is a good word.
proper investigation
Investigation.
to what's going on,
Yeah, yeah.
rather than we're going to find out what you're doing wrong and publish it to
Yeah,
everybody. That'll sort you out.
yeah. I think
I was reading a report. I often scan, particularly primary reports, because there's been very little exceptional in the primary sector. I happened to be reading one yesterday, which um, had got exceptional for achievement, and strong for curriculum and all the others. And the one exception was behaviour and attendance. And it said like behaviour was excellent. Everything about behaviour looked really positive. Attendance was sort of around national average, and it said the school was doing all the right things, and the only recommendation was that it should do more of the right things. Yet it got a lower grade for behaviour and attendance than everything else. What's that?
I mean, this is like going full circle. This is proving Stan's point.
Who is responsible for getting children to school? It's not the school. What everybody says, it's the school. It's not. It's parental responsibility. So are Ofsted going to go out then and batter the parents for not getting the children into school? But that's another one, that schools can do all they can to improve attendance, but there is a limit. They can't do everything.
Yeah. And I think when Ofsted put those two judgments together, at which the chief inspector said I was troubled by that, you think, well, but you signed it off. If you were troubled, you should have done something about it. And it proves to me that there's that lack of awareness of inspection practice going on, but there's also a lack of being inquisitive and asking questions about where's this all heading? What's the likely outcome of this? Most chief inspectors would say to me, developing a framework, what's this going to do to the grade profile? What's going to pop up? That would be part of the briefing paper that would go to the board.
Yeah.
Now, what happened at that point where he said he was troubled? Did he not tell the board that actually we've got a problem here, and actually we're probably so far down the road we can't reverse it? Or, was it that he thought he was trouble, but actually we'll just see how it goes?
Do you remember when we first started inspecting, that attendance was the only piece of national data
that we had?
That was it. So the judgment, I think, had to be above or below national, which was, I'm not sure if it wasn't, it's certainly in the 90s, wasn't it?
It was. Well, I also remember, because I've got it over in the file there, Peter Matthews, who used to be the sort of guru for framework development, and he's passed away now, but I mean, working for Peter was always a challenge, a major challenge. It really was. You were really, you really had to think about what you were doing. But the early frameworks just had one statement: the school's unlikely to be good or unlikely to be satisfactory, something like that, and there was one statement. And that was it on each of those aspects. Didn't say it will not be, it's unlikely to be. And I think that it's funny, as you get older, you think, well, somebody not me, but draw a couple of the old folk back. They'll see some of this. People rooted in inspection, people rooted in school improvement, bring them back. Don't rely on somebody who's got a very narrow range of inspection experience and think that that's going to work to run it past, to get it through nationally. It isn't, because many of us have faced these problems in the past, but there's this lack of desire to bring people back. And I can think of many, many former HMIs who ought to be advising now, really advising on that board, saying, Martyn, this is not going to work. And apparently Christine's today, he's presenting to her a new paper on complaints, adding an independent element to the handling of complaints. That doesn't deal with the independent nature of post-inspection surveys, which is what she wanted, but we haven't got there yet. But I think we do need to get to that. But there may be change afoot on the complaint side. And that's where former HMI need to be That they need to be sniffing around the way those complaints are being managed. I'm not sure if everybody's aware, and we'll finish, that actually most lead inspectors don't find out about a complaint about their work until the complaint has actually been dealt with.
Yeah. So,
We have found that out. So unless it's a really real humdinger, all that happens is the evidence base is used as the defense against the complaint. So obviously, if I swear at you, John, in an say, because I've had one head teacher say to me, I have my senior leadership team and I know that the lead inspector lied. That's a serious complaint, an allegation.
Yes.
And when that complaint was managed, there was no discussion with the lead inspector about what he or she had said. That only came out when the school noticed that the complaint letter came back and there was no reference to what the lead inspector had said in defence of the allegation made by the school. That only came out in the second level of the complaint. Yeah, and clearly, if you're the lead inspector and you've said something, you may not even realise that you've lied. You may, it was so stressful, I didn't know what I said. That is not a place for managing complaint. You can understand why schools get frustrated when everything's closed down so quickly. It all becomes part of the, if it's not in the evidence base, it's not there. It didn't happen.
yeah, don't you think nationally, politically particularly, we're still on this macho approach to everything? New politicians talk about the ability to take hard decisions and to make those hard decisions, and nobody's kind of stopping and saying, well, hang on, why are all our decisions now hard? Why are inspections tough? Why do things have to be, instead of helpful or supportive, or the decisions that are best for the country? Or we might make some nice decisions. We've got, right from the top, you've got to be tougher and harder than the last government or the last person in that role, or and we need somebody to say stop. Let's just refresh and think again about the way we are all acting.
Well, I spoke to a head teacher, in fact, I think I should be there now, speaking to a head teacher who said a couple of weeks ago that after their inspection, they had considered suicide. And anything, that when I hear that, the thing that winds me up is the chief inspector talking about the process rather than what the outcome of that process feels like. And bearing in mind where we started all of this was in Caversham, to end up having a conversation similar to that feels as though it's proof that the system is not working to try and address those problems that the coroner's report highlighted so clearly about what was wrong with inspection. And that's that. Again, I'm hearing lead inspectors saying, no, I've heard enough about that. I don't need to hear anymore. No, you can. And 10-minute conversations with governors about the work they've done. No, I've got enough now, thank you very much. And I mean, it's the DfE announcements. Imagine it's probably going to get worse, isn't it? I'm sorry,
Yes.
I haven't got time to talk to you about that. Got to go and check the food. Got to check the enrichment. Got to check this. Got to check that. This is where it all leads. Right. That was a chat for, wow, gosh, 55 minutes, I think.
My coffee arrived halfway.
That's why I'm going to be late for my call now. But I'm going to say thank you, John, and I hope everybody enjoyed a bit more of a feisty and probably a really. I think what John brings is that sort of knowledge of the inside track of all of this, and I think I was part of that, and I think it's important that people understand the process that happens between the DfE and Ofsted in terms of moving things forward. Somebody said to me before, John, did the DfE ever approve the framework? And exactly what I said. It never came to that.
It's never really.
We used to have regular meetings. We used to work things through, and then it always became then Ofsted's framework.
Yeah.
But the ministers and yourselves were always cited. And we were always open to discussion about those points that you might bring to us.
Yeah, it's ultimately the chief inspector's documents. It has to, because statutorily Ofsted has to have regard to government policy, so it needs to line up.
Yeah.
Yes, you'd have those discussions to make sure things did line up, and that might lead to tweaks and changes, but
Yes.
that's the process that you went through to get to it.
Excellent. Well, until next time, John, and it will be.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And,
Thanks, Rob.
and thank you, Stan, and everybody else who's listening, watching. We hope you have a good week, and we'll be back next week. So until then,
Bear in the heat.
yeah, bear the heat. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.
You too. Bye.